When you conjure an image of Los Angeles, your mind likely fills with postcards of sun-drenched beaches, the iconic Hollywood sign perched in the hills, the sprawling promise of the American dream. It's a city built on glamour ambition and the golden allure of a better life. But there is another reality, a waking nightmare unfolding just blocks away from the gleaming financial district, hidden in plain sight. This is a side of the city that doesn't make it into the travel brochures. Welcome to Skid Row. Here within the confines of less than 1 square mile, an estimated 10,000 human beings navigate a world devoid of the most basic dignities. Stable shelter is a dream clean. Running water is a luxury, and a functioning restroom is a rare privilege. But in recent years, a new, far more sinister shadow has fallen over this already struggling community, a lethal force that is turning a crisis of poverty into an epicenter of a plague. That shadow is fentanyl. This is no longer just a story about homelessness. It has become a narrative of a public health catastrophe spiraling out of control. Many of the faces you see on these streets belong to people who once had careers, mortgages, and families. Think back for a moment. What was the biggest dream you held on to when you were a teenager? What did you hope your life would become? For countless individuals here, those dreams have been systematically dismantled, replaced by a single, desperate, all-consuming goal to simply make it through the next 24 hours. Number 1. The making of a crisis zone, Skid Row was never an accident. It is the deliberate, calculated result of over a century of policy decisions, social engineering, and systemic neglect. Its existence is a product of choices that prioritized commercial development over human welfare, carving out a containment zone for the city's unwanted and forgotten. To understand why fentanyl has taken such a devastating hold here, we have to look at how this ground was tragically fertilized for such a crisis. The story begins in the late 19th century. Los Angeles was booming, the heart of America's westward expansion, a critical hub for the expanding railroad. With the railroads came thousands of transient and seasonal workers, men who arrived with little more than the clothes on their backs and a willingness to perform hard labor. To house this workforce, a constellation of cheap boarding houses and single-room occupancy hotels, or SROs, sprang up around the train depots. These were not homes, they were temporary solutions, bare-bones shelters for a population in constant motion. But as the decades wore on, these temporary settlements began to solidify. By the 1930s, the Great Depression had swept across the nation, leaving hundreds of thousands in California without work or housing. The SROs of Skid Row transformed from transient stops into the last possible refuge for the newly destitute. They were never designed for long-term living with their shared bathrooms and lack of kitchens, but when society offers no other alternative, the temporary becomes permanent. If you were faced with sleeping on the street or in a tiny room with no amenities, what would you choose? For many, the SRO was the only barrier left against utter destitution. The true turning point, however, came in the post-war era. From the 1960s through the 1990s, Los Angeles, like many American cities, embarked on ambitious urban renewal projects. This was a sanitized term for the mass demolition of low-income neighborhoods to make way for shining new high-rises, convention centers, and commercial developments. In this wave of redevelopment, more than 7,000 units of low-cost housing were bulldozed into rubble. The thousands of people displaced, many of them elderly or disabled, were given few, if any, options. Systematically, they were funneled into the one place the city seemed content to let decay Skid Row. This concentration of poverty was then compounded by devastating policy shifts in the 1980s and 90s. Severe budget cuts to social programs and community mental health services effectively dismantled America's support system for its most vulnerable. Psychiatric hospitals were closed, social safety nets were shredded, and the responsibility for care was abdicated. Individuals who once would have received treatment were now left to fend for themselves on the streets. So, no Skid Row did not appear by chance. It was engineered. A century of decisions created a densely populated open-air ghetto for those struggling with poverty trauma and untreated mental illness. This long history of containment and neglect didn't just create a hub of homelessness. It cultivated the perfect storm, the ideal breeding ground for a crisis like the fentanyl epidemic. It created a community saturated with despair, making its residents tragically susceptible to a cheap, potent, and readily available drug that offers a momentary escape at the ultimate price. The question isn't just how Skid Row came to be, but how we allowed a space of such profound human suffering to become a familiar, accepted part of a modern city's landscape. Number 2. Life on the front lines of an epidemic. What does daily existence look like when the most basic infrastructure of a city has collapsed for an entire community? On Skid Row, it is a relentless, minute-by-minute battle for survival, a battle that has been made infinitely more deadly by the scourge of fentanyl. Public health reports have for years sounded the alarm. A joint audit from 2017, for example, exposed a shocking reality: a mere 9 public toilets were available overnight for a population of nearly 1,800 unsheltered individuals. That is 1 toilet for every 200 people. Imagine the constant threat of disease, the complete lack of privacy, the utter loss of dignity. Now layer a deadly addiction crisis on top of that. Imagine trying to fight the overwhelming cravings of an opioid withdrawal when you cannot even find a safe, clean place to be sick. How can anyone even begin to think about recovery when their entire environment is a public health hazard? This fundamental lack of sanitation has a direct and catastrophic impact on the fentanyl crisis. The constant stress, the risk of infection, and the physical degradation weaken the body and the spirit, making it harder to resist the drug's pull. The streets themselves become a vector for disease, and for those using needles, the risk of infections like sepsis and HIV skyrockets. The impact of this strain extends far beyond hygiene. Without shelter, people are exposed to the brutal extremes of the California climate, scorching summer heat and cold, damp winters. Their health deteriorates. A city-led cleanup operation in 2014 found that over 100 individuals in just one sweep were in need of immediate medical or mental health intervention. Today, official data shows that between 36 and 38% of Skid Row residents struggle with severe mental health conditions, while countless others live with profound physical disabilities and deep-seated trauma. Fentanyl does not cause this suffering, but it feeds on it. It presents itself as a solution to the pain, a chemical blanket against a world of hardship. The very efforts meant to manage the area often make the crisis worse. These sweeps, city-led efforts to clear encampments are particularly devastating. In these operations, people don't just lose their tents and belongings, they lose everything. Vital medications for chronic illnesses, life-saving naloxone kits for reversing overdoses, personal identification documents needed to access services, and the phone numbers of social workers are all thrown away like garbage. The streets may appear cleaner to passing commuters for a few hours, but for the residents, their fragile path to stability is shattered, and their risk of a fatal overdose increases exponentially. If you were stripped of everything you owned in a single morning, what one object or piece of information would be the most devastating to lose? For many here, it's the very tool that could save their life or a friend's. This constant disruption and re-traumatization actively undermines any effort at recovery, pushing people further into the depths of addiction. The real lesson from Skid Row's Frontlines isn't just the sight of tents. It's understanding how a city's systemic failures are actively fueling the deadliest drug epidemic in American history. Number 3. A billion-dollar system versus a 50-cent pill to combat this sprawling crisis of humanity. The city of Los Angeles has waged a billion-dollar war. Between the years 2020 and 2025, official budgets allocated over $1 billion to address homelessness. An astronomical sum of money that suggests a monumental effort. But on the streets of Skid Row, in the alleyways, and under the tarps, it is tragically clear that the city is losing a much cheaper, yet far deadlier war against a 50-cent pill. Why is this mountain of funding failing to turn the tide against the fentanyl epidemic? The answer lies in a devastating mismatch of speed scale and reality. Consider the city's primary long-term solution: permanent supportive housing. According to city data, it costs on average more than $600,000 to build a single individual housing unit. The process from initial conception and funding approval to construction and final habitation takes roughly 3 to 5 years. 3 to 5 years. Now contrast that with the timeline of fentanyl. A person can become physically dependent on this powerful synthetic opioid in a matter of weeks. A fatal overdose can happen in a matter of minutes. This staggering gap between the slow, methodical pace of the solution and the lightning speed of the crisis defines the city's struggle. The system is designed to build buildings. It is not designed to save lives in the middle of a fast-moving public health emergency. Let's examine one of the city's most high-profile and well-intentioned initiatives, a program called Inside Safe. Launched as a top priority, its goal was to rapidly move people from street encampments directly into interim housing, like hotels and motels, bypassing the often clogged shelter system. On the surface, the numbers looked promising. By the middle of 2023, the program had successfully moved over 1,300 individuals indoors. But when you look deeper, the cracks in the strategy begin to show, especially in the context of a drug epidemic. As of late 2024, a follow-up analysis revealed that only 23% of those placed in hotels through the program had successfully transitioned into any form of permanent housing. Even more telling, by early 2023, less than 1% were classified as having achieved that goal. The program was proving to be a temporary fix, not a permanent solution. For a person battling a powerful fentanyl addiction, being placed in a motel room without immediate, intensive, and continuous wraparound services like addiction counseling, medical treatment, and mental health support is often just a brief stop on a revolving door back to the street. Once the temporary placement ends and with no permanent option ready, where do they go? They often go right back to the environment where the drug is easiest to find. The bureaucratic process itself forms an invisible yet impenetrable barrier. To open a single temporary shelter or a transitional housing facility, not even a permanent building or project can require as many as 12 separate departmental approvals. This labyrinth of red tape can stretch the timeline to 1 or even 2 years. Think about that. The time it takes for the city to approve a facility meant to save lives is longer than the time it takes for hundreds of people to die from an overdose. If you knew a fire was raging through a building, would you spend 2 years debating the color of the fire truck, or would you grab the nearest bucket of water? These combined barriers, the prohibitive cost, the glacial pace of construction, and the suffocating bureaucracy, form more than just a challenge. They form a system that is fundamentally ill-equipped to fight the war it is facing. The funding is there. The policies exist on paper, but they are being deployed in a system that spends enormous sums of money for a limited and tragically slow return. The result is a system that consistently fails to deliver timely, effective aid to its most vulnerable, not for a lack of money, but because of the suffocating weight of its own complexity. It is a system trying to solve a 21st century chemical crisis with a 20th century bureaucratic mindset. And in the gap between intention and action, lives are being lost every single day. Number 4, Two Coasts 1. Unspoken War. This story of systemic failure in the face of a fentanyl onslaught is not unique to Los Angeles. To truly understand the scale of this crisis, we must look 3,000 miles east to a neighborhood that has become the East Coast's own harrowing symbol of the opioid epidemic, Kensington Avenue in Philadelphia. Though they sit on opposite ends of the country, Skid Row and Kensington mirror each other in the most sobering of ways. It isn't just the visual landscape of makeshift shelters crafted from tarps and shopping carts. It's the palpable sense of a silent war being waged on American soil, a war where the casualties are stacking up on city sidewalks. It's the chilling silence of a system that is still fumbling for effective solutions. A system that has allowed its most vulnerable citizens to be pushed to the absolute margins, not just of the city, but of society itself. In Skid Row, as we've seen, nearly 10,000 unhoused individuals are concentrated in a small, dense area. Los Angeles has implemented large-scale, top-down government policies like Housing First and the aforementioned Inside Safe program. The strategy is centralized, heavily funded, and bureaucratic. Yet the scale of the problem, particularly the mortality rate from fentanyl, continues to climb, consistently overwhelming the results of these programs. Kensington Avenue in Philadelphia tells a strikingly similar story, but through a different lens. Once a proud, bustling working-class neighborhood, it is now home to an estimated 4,500 people living on the streets, and it is widely considered to be the largest open-air drug market on the East Coast. Unlike Los Angeles, Philadelphia's official response has often been less centralized with fewer massive city-run interventions. In many ways, the fight for life in Kensington relies more heavily on the tireless efforts of grassroots community groups and nonprofit outreach workers. Volunteers walk the streets handing out food hygiene kits and the overdose reversal drug Narcan, not because it's a well-funded government initiative, but because someone has to. They are medics in a war that has never been officially declared. The core difference isn't in the number of people suffering, but in the structure of the response. Yet despite these different approaches, both places are caught in the same vicious, heartbreaking cycle. People lose their housing, fall into the grips of a powerful addiction, find some form of temporary relief, and all too often return to the street again. The underlying problem remains the same: a profound lack of accessible, on-demand, long-term addiction treatment and mental health care. A shelter bed for a few nights is not a substitute for intensive detox and recovery services. These places, Skid Row and Kensington, are more than just addresses on a map. They were once vibrant communities filled with homes and families. Now they stand as dire national warning signs. They are irrefutable evidence that the fentanyl crisis is not a localized problem. It is a deeply American one, festering in the wounds of deindustrialization, economic inequality, and a healthcare system that has failed to treat addiction and mental illness with the urgency and resources they demand. These streets are a reflection not of the people who live on them, but of the systemic challenges we have failed to confront as a nation. And if we continue to allow our most fragile members to fight this battle alone on the margins, the bright lights of our cities will inevitably dim. Number 5. A warning that echoes nationwide: Skid Row is not an island. It is a magnifying glass concentrating and revealing a crisis that is now quietly spreading through every corner of the nation. What is unfolding on these 50 square blocks of Los Angeles is a dire warning about the fragility of modern life and the devastating consequences of a society that struggles to reconcile its ideals of prosperity with the realities of inclusion and healthcare equity. The numbers for Los Angeles County in 2024 paint a terrifying picture. Officials reported over 75,000 individuals living without stable housing, a staggering 11% increase from the previous year alone. But within that number is an even more shocking statistic. 13% of those individuals had a full-time job and a stable income just 1 year before ending up on the streets. Think about that. These are not strangers to responsibility. They are our former coworkers, our neighbors, the parents who sat next to us at school events. What happens when a single catastrophic event, a medical emergency, a sudden layoff pushes someone out of their home and into a state of profound despair? On the streets of Skid Row, that despair is now being met by the deadliest predator imaginable: fentanyl. How many of them do you think fell into the grip of addiction after losing the stability that anchored their lives? In response to this growing humanitarian crisis, the city is forced into a difficult balancing act. Vast portions of the public budget are redirected to fund emergency programs, paramedics, outreach teams, and temporary shelters. But this is a zero-sum game. Every dollar spent on managing the immediate crisis is a dollar that cannot be spent on preventing the next one. The strain ripples outwards, affecting everything. Schools, public libraries, sanitation services, and public safety for all residents feel the pressure. What we are witnessing is no longer a localized emergency that can be contained within Skid Row. It has become a national health crisis playing out as a housing crisis, and it is straining the very fabric of our cities. Perhaps it is time we stop asking how much more money we can apply to the visible symptoms, the tents, the overdoses, and instead start asking the harder questions. Where did the underlying trauma, the economic insecurity, and the profound lack of accessible mental health care really begin? Skid Row is not a reflection on those who live in it. It is the product of a system that struggles to reconcile growth with compassion, expansion with equity. It is the direct consequence of a healthcare system that treats addiction as a moral failing rather than a medical disease. And the longer we as a society accept that certain people can become invisible, out of sight, out of mind, the more fragile the foundation of our cities becomes. If Skid Row represents a shadow of despair, then fentanyl is the plague that thrives in that darkness. Our collective awareness, our demand for compassionate and effective action, is the only light that can keep it from growing. Number 6. The angels in the epicenter. Yet even here in the heart of this darkness, where the noise of daily struggle and the wail of ambulance sirens can drown out all hope, there are beacons of unwavering compassion. They are the frontline responders in this unspoken war against fentanyl, armed not with billion-dollar budgets or government mandates, but with simple, profound humanity. They show up day after day, not with promises, but with presence. And in a place defined by chaos, that consistency is a lifeline. Consider the Midnight Mission, a Los Angeles institution founded in 1914. For over a century, it has stood as a bastion of hope. Every single day, its team prepares and distributes around 3,000 hot meals. But their mission goes far beyond food. They offer hot showers, clean clothes, and most critically in this new era, comprehensive job training and addiction recovery programs. This is ground zero for those seeking a way out. Its legendary former leader Clancy Imislund was once homeless and battling alcoholism himself. His powerful story of recovery and leadership is more than just inspiring. It is a living testament to the fact that lives can be completely rebuilt when someone offers a genuine second chance. Then there is the innovative work of Lava Mae. What started in San Francisco now serves Skid Row with mobile hygiene units, converted city buses transformed into clean private shower and restroom stalls. Their motto is delivering radical hospitality. To date, they have provided over 100,000 hygiene services. For a person deep in the throes of fentanyl addiction, where self-worth has been eroded to nothing, a hot shower is not a small thing. It is a moment of dignity. It's a moment where someone looks them in. The eye speaks their name and sees them as a human being worthy of care. In parallel, the tiny homes villages represent a new pragmatic approach to transitional housing. These compact, secure shelters, just 6 to 8 square meters in size, cost an average of $42,000 per bed to build, a fraction of the cost of traditional housing. They provide electricity, a locking door, and a bed. But what they truly offer is something invaluable for recovery, safety, privacy, and stability. For the first time in years, residents can sleep through the night without fear. This small measure of security is a critical foundation upon which the hard work of recovery can begin. These acts of care prove that even in the face of a terrifying epidemic, humanity remains the most powerful antidote. Number 7. The quiet acts of defiance. For every massive systemic gap that remains unaddressed, there are individuals and small organizations attempting to fill the silence, not with grand speeches, but with small, steady, defiant actions. Skid Row, so often portrayed as a monolith of despair, is also home to something far more enduring: resilience in its quietest and most powerful form. These are the acts of defiance against the hopelessness that fentanyl feeds on. Among these efforts is an organization named Chrysalis, which focuses on a critical, often overlooked piece of the recovery puzzle: a job. They are fighting this war on the economic front. Unlike emergency shelters, Chrysalis provides resume training, interview preparation, and job placement services specifically tailored for individuals who have experienced long periods of instability, homelessness, or incarceration. In 2023 alone, they helped over 1,500 people find employment in Los Angeles County. A job is so much more than a paycheck. It's structure, it's purpose, it's a reason to stay sober for another day. What makes their approach so unique is the peer-based model. Staff members often have their own lived experience. This builds a level of trust and understanding that traditional systems can rarely achieve. On the streets, these invisible threads of kindness continue weaving a fragile safety net of community. A local group of barbers comes once a month to offer free haircuts. For someone who has been invisible for so long, looking in a mirror and seeing a person who looks cared for can be a transformative experience. It's dignity, it's being seen. Meanwhile, artists and musicians, some of whom once lost everything to these same streets, now return to perform at small outdoor community events, organized not by the city but by residents themselves. These are small gatherings, but they breathe life and joy into a space so often defined by pain. While these grassroots efforts may not change city policy overnight, they create something more immediate and arguably more vital connection. And in places like Skid Row, especially in the isolating grip of addiction, connection is the currency of survival. The story unfolding here is not just about a public health crisis or systemic gaps. It's about the fierce resistance of the human spirit. Every meal handed out, every wound cleaned, every Narcan dose administered by a stranger, it chips away at the silence and the despair. Because in the absence of large-scale answers, the smallest gestures of defiance continue to speak the loudest. Skid Row is not an unfamiliar story. It is a stark and painful reminder of a promise we have broken to our most vulnerable citizens. It reveals in graphic detail what happens when decades of systemic neglect collide head-on with the deadliest drug epidemic in American history. From flawed urban policies of the past to the bureaucratic paralysis of the present, our systems have slowly pushed a population into the shadows, into a place where a predator like fentanyl can thrive. And yet, even in that profound darkness, glimmers of defiance shine through. They are found in the hands that offer a hot meal, in the quiet compassion of an outreach worker, in the safety of a tiny home that offers a first night of peaceful sleep in years. These small, persistent gestures are the front line in the battle for hope, the quiet acts of rebellion against an epidemic of despair. If this story gave you something to reflect on, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to Bear City 20. Your support allows us to continue shining a light on the stories that demand to be told and on the people who deserve more than anything to be seen.